Some video games truly shoot for the moon, and, some of them don't quite land on that moon. Here are some overly ambitious games that flopped, either financially or just by player expectations. And if you want to read up more about these, all of our sources will be linked in the description down below. Starting off at number 10, let's talk Mass Effect Andromeda. Now, the 1-2 punch of Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem really did a number on BioWare's reputation. You know, both games could easily fit into a list like this, but in many ways, Andromeda was a much more ambitious game than Anthem. The real issues with Anthem seemed to be that nobody at BioWare knew what it was supposed to be, while with Andromeda, they had an entire trilogy of Mass Effect games to draw inspiration from, and still managed to create a game that nearly killed the franchise. The original vision for Andromeda was that it was going to be a game about exploration. You know, the original Mass Effect game had some planets you could explore outside of the main missions, but they were generally kind of half-baked. Andromeda was going to take that kernel of an idea from the first game and expand upon it massively. They wanted to have hundreds of explorable planets, which they planned to be mostly procedurally generated. You know, they wanted you to be able to manually fly a ship and directly land on planets. Basically, it was going to be a lot like what we've seen of Bethesda's Starfield, or more importantly, No Man's Sky now that it's good, but like, you know, before that. Now, it was a fine idea in theory, but they ran into endless problems trying to get the space model to work with EA's Frostbite engine, and they struggled to figure out how to get all this procedurally generated stuff to even work in a Mass Effect game. According to a report from Kotaku, with deadlines fast approaching, a lot of that ambitious stuff was dumped because nobody could really figure out what it would actually add to the game, and what we ended up getting was a kind of dull set of open world areas, and a game that remains not really very solid on a fundamental level. It's rare you see a major game get abandoned as quickly as Andromeda was. It definitely had its fans, sure, there are some people out there that still really like it, but it was such a flop that BioWare decided to just give up on it and move on to other projects like Anthem, which it's a whole other bag of worms. Next, over at number 9, let's talk XCOM. Yes, well, XCOM that would eventually become the Bureau XCOM Declassified. Now, this game isn't brought up too much when talking about big, ambitious failures, probably because the game that eventually came out looks nothing like the original version of the game that was advertised. Originally just called XCOM, the game was a pretty unique-looking first-person shooter where you and a team of agents investigate this strange alien phenomenon. It looked like it would have been part Ghostbusters, part Phasmophobia, maybe a little X-Files thrown in, and it seemed like it could have been something special had it been called anything other than XCOM, because let's face it, there's nothing about this that looks similar to the original XCOM, UFO Defense, which was a top-down strategy game. Remember, and believe it or not, this is crazy looking back, this XCOM announcement trailer came out before anybody knew about the Firaxis developed new kind of classic style XCOM Enemy Unknown, which ended up being absolutely awesome, a surprise hit that single-handedly revitalized the turn-based strategy genre. This game was meant to include strange and weird, unknowable enemies, which seems cool, but the developers... Now, according to reports from Polygon and TV Tropes, the whole thing really lacked direction, and progress stalled until they eventually just gave up on the entire original premise and made this half-baked third-person shooter with some strategy elements instead. And to be honest, that, like, a lot of people forgot that even came out. Next, over at number 8, let's talk Crash Twinsanity. One word you rarely hear when talking about the post-Naughty Dog era of Crash Bandicoot is ambitious. Now, the first game after the series went third-party was The Wrath of Cortex, one of the all-time least ambitious sequels ever. It was still solid, but they played it safe. And with a small amount of time to make the game, you can't really blame the developers for sticking with what works. The next major game in this series was going to be bigger and better. Originally called Crash Bandicoot Evolution, the game was meant to be a kind of soft reboot, which would have been edgier and had a new enemy steal Crash's island and attach it to a giant planet made from pieces of another planet. That sounds like a fun idea, but there was one problem. The recently released Ratchet & Clank had a fairly similar plot, so they were forced to scrap the idea entirely. They totally ended up rebooting the game, and instead of making it darker, they went in a more comedic direction. It was a fine idea, but all that wasted time means that huge chunks of this new version of the game had to be cut because of the constraints. Entire characters and levels were apparently pulled, some that were almost finished, just to get the game out the door in time. This one was meant to be a huge new reimagining for Crash Bandicoot, but it ended up being this weird half-baked thing, even if there is still a lot of stuff to like about it. It's worth pointing out, some people still have a lot of love for this one, so just saying. Now, next over at number 7, Advent Rising. Oh boy, do you remember this one? Not a lot of people do, but I do. This story begins with GlyphX, a support studio who was looking to break into the big leagues of gaming. This wasn't just going to be a game. Like, Advent Rising was supposed to be an entire multimedia franchise, with the first, and I mean, as of right now, the only game meant to be the start of a planned trilogy of games. This is one of those games that was ambitious to the point of hubris, I think. The studio was completely unprepared to make a game as big as this one was supposed to be, while being led by a certified ideas guy that seemed more interested in the future than what they were actually doing with the present, with making the game. And the final product was infamously a strange mess, you know, this hodgepodge of ideas nicked from popular games, especially Halo, where its one defining feature, the flick aiming system, was a bit awkward. It's one of those games that appeared with a ton of hype and then it just disappeared just as quickly. Next over at number 6, Defiance. You remember this one? Defiance was this weird MMO/TV crossover with the ambitious idea that what players do in the game can have an effect on the events of the show. Now, there's a lot of wishful thinking going into something like this. The MMO has to constantly update to keep up with the show, while the show has to be popular enough on its own to stay on the air. It's one of those ideas that probably sounds good to an advertising executive, like it's the ultimate cross-promotion something thing, but there were just so many ways the whole thing could fall apart, and yeah, it did. Interest in the game, while the game itself wasn't that bad, I actually thought some of it was kind of cool, it started to quickly fade, and while they tried a few things to keep people playing, the content was just a little too shallow to keep a steady player base. If anything, the show ended up sticking around longer than we thought. Back when the game came out, we just assumed that the show would be done in a year, but it managed to go along for 4 seasons. Neither the game or the show, though, ended up being much of a success, but the idea behind the whole thing was really ambitious as hell. We gotta give them props for that. Now over at number 5, I'm excited. Let's talk Too Human. Originally, it was announced back in 1999 for the original PlayStation, and then it finally came out in 2008 on the Xbox 360. That's full 3 console generations later. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Too Human had kind of like a rocky development, man. The reason the game took so long to come out was that the developers, Silicon Knights, had development deals that took priority over Too Human. This happens sometimes. Silicon Knights was too busy with games like Eternal Darkness and the GameCube Metal Gear Solid remake Twin Snakes, and Too Human just kind of kept needing more time. Still, the original version was incredibly ambitious, like a third-person 3D action game meant to span 4 PlayStation discs, equivalent to like a Final Fantasy IX or The Legend of Dragoon, so the game was meant to be massive. Now, when they got Microsoft to agree to publish the game on Xbox 360, Too Human was meant to be the first game in a planned trilogy, but of course, other things got in the way, like a lawsuit with Epic Games over the Unreal Engine. Now, when the game finally came out, what we got was anything but ambitious. It was a basic hack and slash, with the only interesting thing about it being its weird cyberpunk meets Norse mythology setting, and for me, that was why I stuck with it. I still enjoyed playing it, but ultimately it wasn't low sales that killed the game, at least not completely. It was the utter stupidity of the whole Epic Games lawsuit thing, which Silicon Knights didn't just lose, they were countersued and forced to destroy all copies of the game, alongside the similarly troubled X-Men Destiny. Next over at number 4, the 2000s were a weird time for games. After the 2004 release of World of Warcraft, everyone wanted to make the next big MMO, and pretty much all of them ended up being disappointments or crashing and burning in a big way. Now, one of the biggest failures of all time was Tabula Rasa, a blockbuster MMO that was meant to be a persistent shooter that combined action gameplay with RPG elements, which was pretty ambitious for the time. Now, this was actually created by Richard Garriott Lothario, aka Lord British, you know, the guy responsible for the Ultima series. So this game was meant to be massive and apparently cost its publisher over $100 million to make. So there's a lot of money put into this one. Shout out to alteredgamer.com for breaking down a timeline of this game's development. It was ambitious, but it never really managed to meet reality. The game's launch was a disaster, with many of its missions kind of bugged and most players having to deal with unplayable levels of lag. Now, ironically, for a game called Tabula Rasa, which is actually Latin for blank slate, there was hardly any actual game in the final version. Pretty much all there was to do was run around and shoot random enemies. The game never managed to find a player base, and eventually it was shut down over low subscriber numbers. Now down to number 3, let's talk Jurassic Park Trespasser. Basically everything that was originally planned for the game ended up being broken at some level. You were supposed to be able to use melee weapons, but they could never get them to work. Dinosaurs were supposed to have these advanced AI routines that would control their behavior, but the whole thing was so broken that the dinos would just stand there. They were kind of stuck, unable to choose a mood, so they would just not do anything. We know a lot about this behind the scenes stuff thanks to an article from gamedeveloper.com. The game was meant to have high quality textures that would have made the game like really cutting edge visually, but they ran into compatibility issues that forced them to make the game launch way uglier. They weren't even able to use the Jurassic Park music because someone screwed up the licensing deal. Basically, the developers seemed like they were completely unprepared to make a game like this, and the final result had some cool stuff, like some cool physics, but like that's one of the only things that actually worked and was cool about the game. It was ultimately a total bummer and a huge disappointment. Down to number 2, let's talk Daikatana. This was supposed to be the next big thing from Doom developer John Romero, the video game legend. Unfortunately, an infamous advertising campaign for the game made it the subject of ridicule before it even came out, and then like the kind of buggy, strange mess that was released to the public really kind of finished the job of hurting some credibility. Because Daikatana was supposed to be huge, you know, an FPS game made by one of the pioneers of the genre, free to do whatever the hell he wanted, with his own game studio called Ion Storm. Now, originally, it was meant to ship in 1997, but the game saw numerous delays and ended up being kind of a joke for a while. And all this was before it even came out. Now, the thing about the game is that, compared to most of the stuff on this list, this one actually has most of its planned features intact, like the companions and the 4 different time periods, which had their own unique sets of weapons. This time, the problem isn't that the game was cut to pieces to meet a deadline or anything like that. The problem is that the game just isn't good. The companion AI is almost completely lifeless. You know, they get in the way constantly and have to be babysat at all times because if they die, then you lose. Many of the guns are awkward to use and are too gimmicky. The levels can be maze-like and kind of annoying, and there are way too many tiny little enemies that are hard to hit. The game just straight up isn't very fun. But unfortunately, Daikatana just floundered as a result. Now down to number 1, let's talk APB, All Points Bulletin. This was made by Real Time Worlds, the guys behind the first Crackdown. It was an incredibly ambitious project that was basically going to be GTA Online 3 years before that came, and with an almost obsessive level of player expression and customization and stuff to do. Now, that level of customization options are still impressive, even today. The character creation alone is huge. But on top of that, you can completely customize your car, create custom sprays, change pretty much everything about your clothes, design custom tattoos. There was even an in-game music editor that let you create your own custom death theme whenever you killed someone. This stuff wasn't just for show, like, too. You could actually sell your custom designs on the in-game market. But the rest of the game, it wasn't so interesting. The game we finally eventually got was basically just a series of randomly generated PvP missions in a few small open world city areas. Clearly, the game was meant to be much, much bigger, but at some point they had to give up their MMO plans and just make it a relatively modest PvP shooter. It definitely does not play like one of the most expensive games ever made. This is another one that cost over $100 million to make when it finally came out in 2010. The game didn't even last 3 months in its original incarnation. Real Time Worlds went into administration, and the game was sold for a measly $1.5 million in the United Kingdom, and it's somehow still been going under one publisher or another ever since. It was a game that was meant to be the ultimate Grand Theft Auto style MMO, but the whole thing crashed and burned. By the time the actual Grand Theft Auto Online came out, APB was already forgotten. But those are some big ambitious games with cool ideas that ultimately it didn't quite work out. Some of these games still have their player base, and if that's you, we want to hear from you down in the comments, or if you were looking forward to one of these games and you ultimately were left disappointed, let us know why. If you like talking games with us, all you gotta do is click the like button. We very much appreciate that. And if you're new, consider subscribing because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.